Margaret Doyle did not look at Ethan Walker the way every other woman in that square looked at him. She looked at him the way you look at something that is quietly destroying itself and doesn't know it yet. Then she walked straight toward him through the crowd, through the heat, through 5 years of women who had tried and failed, and she said loud enough for half the town to hear, "Everyone keeps asking what kind of wife you want. Nobody ever asks whether you're tired of pretending you don't need anyone." The square went silent. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every comment means the world to me, and I read every single one. Now, let's begin. The annual livestock fair in Caldwell Creek was the kind of event that made the whole of Montana Territory feel small and loud and alive all at once. Cattle lowed in temporary pens. Merchants hollered prices over each other. Children ran between boots and wagon wheels. The smell of sawdust and roasted corn and sun-baked earth settled over everything like a second skin. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Ethan Walker stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and his eyes aimed at nothing in particular, the way a man stands when he has trained himself to be present in body while remaining entirely absent in spirit. He was tall. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Tall and broad and weathered in the particular way that Montana weather weathers, a man not gently, not kindly, but honestly leaving behind something that looked less like decoration and more like evidence. His hat was good quality, but not showy. His shirt had been laundered, but not pressed. He wore no jewelry, carried no pocket watch, and made no effort whatsoever to appear charming, which was by most accounts the single most effective thing a man in his position could possibly do. Every unmarried woman in 3 counties had tried to reach him. Every one of them had failed. Clara Hennessy had made him a pie, apple from scratch with a perfect lattice crust. He had thanked her with 3 words, set the pie on his wagon seat, and driven home alone. Dorothy Aldrich had arranged for her father to invite Ethan to supper. He had come, eaten quietly, complimented the roast, and left before the coffee was poured. Louise Marsh had written him an actual letter. 2 pages, careful handwriting, genuine warmth. He had responded with a single paragraph so polite and so final that Louise said afterward it felt less like a rejection and more like a door being closed from the inside by someone who had already decided never to open it again. The women of Caldwell Creek did not hate Ethan Walker for any of this. You cannot hate a man for grieving. What they hated quietly, and never quite openly, was the particular species of helplessness he inspired, the sense that no matter how beautiful you were, no matter how clever, how warm, how eligible, none of it would ever be the right key for that particular lock. His wife, the one who had left him, had been gone 5 years now. Her name was Rebecca, and she had packed her things and walked out 3 days before the wedding and married a banker from Billings without so much as a written apology. No one in Caldwell Creek ever spoke Rebecca's name around Ethan Walker. It had become over the years one of those conversational voids that entire communities learn to navigate around the way water finds a path around a stone. What nobody said because nobody wanted to be the one to say it was that Ethan Walker had not just lost Rebecca. He had lost the version of himself that believed he was worth staying for. And that was the wound that never healed. Margaret Doyle arrived at the Caldwell Creek Livestock Fair on a Tuesday in the back of a freight wagon, sitting on a crate of dry goods, with a leather satchel across her knees, and a practical hat pulled low against the sun. She was 31 years old. She was by the uncharitable standards of a territory that judged women primarily on 2 criteria, youth and slenderness, not beautiful. Her dress was plain cotton, cut for practicality rather than effect, and after 3 days of summer travel across open country, it had lost whatever crispness it might once have had. Her collar was damp. Her face was flushed with heat. There was dust on her boots and a smear of wagon grease on her left cuff that she had apparently decided was not worth the effort of addressing. She climbed down from the freight wagon without waiting for assistance, adjusted her satchel strap, and stood for a moment in the middle of the fairground, looking around with the calm, assessing expression of someone taking inventory. Not of the goods on display, of the situation. 2 women nearby noticed her at the same moment, and exchanged a glance that contained entire paragraphs. The shorter one, whose name was Clara Hennessy, raised her fan and said something behind it. The taller one, Dorothy Aldrich, pressed her lips together in the particular way that substitutes for laughter when laughter would be too obvious. Margaret noticed the glance. She had been noticing that specific variety of glance since approximately the age of 12, and she had long since stopped requiring it to mean anything about her. She adjusted her hat, picked a direction, and started walking. The direction she picked, whether by instinct or observation, or some combination of the two, was straight toward Ethan Walker. She had not planned to approach him specifically. She had come to the fair for one reason only: to ask around about available bookkeeping work in the area, because her former employer, a decent man named Silas Pratt, who had run a dry goods business in Helena, had died 6 weeks ago of a sudden fever, and the business had died with him, and Margaret's employment had died with the business, and she had found herself for the first time in her adult life without a plan. She was not accustomed to being without a plan. She had spotted the man from across the fairground, not because he was the most attractive person present, though the women of Caldwell Creek would have argued the point, but because he was the most isolated. A crowd had a way of organizing itself around certain people, and in that crowd on that afternoon, every social current curved toward Ethan Walker, and then broke just short of him the way waves break just short of a particular rock. Not because the rock invites them, but because something in its stillness says this far and no further. She had watched that phenomenon for approximately 4 minutes before she understood what she was looking at. Not arrogance, fear. The particular fear of a man who has been hurt badly enough that his entire social architecture has reorganized itself around a single principle. If you don't let anyone close enough to matter, you cannot be destroyed by losing them. Margaret had seen that architecture before. She had seen it in her father after her mother died. She had seen it in her employer after his son left for the territories and never wrote back. She recognized it the way you recognize a building that has been reinforced in all the wrong places. It looks stronger than it is, and the places where the damage is worst are exactly the places that look the most solid. She walked toward him. He did not see her coming. He was watching a cattle auction taking place 20 yards away, not with any particular interest, but with the focused blankness of a man who has chosen a fixed point to stare at, so that he does not have to interact with the people around him. "Excuse me," Margaret said, when she was close enough that the words were clearly intended for him. He turned. His eyes did what everyone's eyes did when they landed on her for the first time: a quick, involuntary assessment, a brief internal categorization, and then the particular variety of polite blankness that men wore when they had decided a woman was not worth further attention. Except that she did not give him time to settle into the blankness. "I notice," she said pleasantly, as if she were commenting on the weather, "that half the women at this fair have been trying to get near you for the last hour, and you've spent that same hour engineering reasons not to be gotten near, which is your own business. But I'm not here for that particular competition, so you can relax." Ethan blinked. It was, she would think later, the most genuine expression she had seen on his face all afternoon. "I beg your pardon," he said. His voice was low and careful. The voice of a man who had learned to measure his words the way a careful man measures ammunition. "I'm looking for work," Margaret said. "Bookkeeping, accounting, financial management. I've been doing it professionally for 8 years. My last employer died unexpectedly, and I'm told there are several large ranching operations in this area that might benefit from professional financial oversight." She paused. "Your name came up twice in the last half hour while I was asking around, and both times the person saying it looked slightly uncomfortable, which in my experience means the finances are not in good order. So I thought I'd come and ask directly." Ethan stared at her. Around them the fair continued its noise and heat and movement. Someone won something at the cattle auction and shouted about it. A child knocked over a jar of hard candy and burst into tears. "The finances of my ranch," Ethan said slowly, "are not something I generally discuss with strangers at the fairground." "I understand that," Margaret said, "but they're also not something you've apparently been discussing with anyone who knows what they're doing, which seems to be producing a different set of problems." She tilted her head slightly. "I'm not asking you to trust me on the basis of a 2-minute conversation. I'm asking whether the conversation is worth continuing somewhere less public." He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that is trying to decide something. "What's your name?" he finally said. "Margaret Doyle." "Where are you from?" "Helena originally, before that Ohio." "You have references?" "Several. All of them require a letter to reach since the people who wrote them aren't in the immediate vicinity, but I can provide names and you can verify to your satisfaction." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm not asking you to hand me the ledgers this afternoon. I'm asking whether you'd like to sit down somewhere with shade and have a conversation about whether this is worth exploring." Another pause. Then something shifted, almost imperceptibly in Ethan Walker's expression. Not warmth exactly, more like the absence of the particular vigilance he had been maintaining. "There's a table near the east end of the grounds," he said. "They usually have lemonade." "That would be welcome," Margaret said. "It's extremely hot." They walked there. Clara Hennessy saw them go and nearly dropped her fan. Dorothy Aldrich watched with her mouth slightly open. 3 other women in the immediate vicinity exchanged a rapid series of glances that constituted among them an entire conversation about what had just happened and what it meant, and how it was possible that that woman had just walked up to Ethan Walker and been invited somewhere, which was something that none of them had managed in 5 years of considerably more strategic effort. What none of them understood, because none of them had been listening with the same ears, was that Margaret had not approached Ethan Walker as a woman hoping to become something to him. She had approached him as a professional who had correctly identified a problem and had an actual solution to offer. That was a language he understood. The romance industry, had anyone thought to describe it that way in 1878, was entirely unfamiliar to him. The offer of genuine competent assistance was something else entirely. They sat at the table by the east end of the grounds, and a boy brought them lemonade, and Margaret opened her satchel and produced a small notebook and a pencil, and they talked for 45 minutes about the financial management of Ethan Walker's ranch. By the end of those 45 minutes, Ethan knew 3 things. The first was that Margaret Doyle knew more about ranch financial management than anyone he had ever spoken to, including the bank officer in Caldwell Creek, who had been supposed to advise him on such matters and had been doing a notably inadequate job of it. The second was that the specific areas of his operation she had identified as likely to be problematic supplier contracts, payroll inconsistencies, and the pricing structure on his fall cattle sales were in fact the exact areas where he had been losing money without being able to identify why. The third thing was harder to name. It was the experience of having a conversation with a person who was not performing anything. Every conversation Ethan Walker had had with a woman in the past 5 years, every one had contained a performance. Sometimes an elaborate one, sometimes subtle, but always present the careful arrangement of words and expressions designed to produce a particular effect, to make him think something, or feel something, or want something. Margaret Doyle was not performing. She was simply talking to him in the way you talk to a person about a problem that interests you both. He found it disorienting in a way he could not immediately explain. "I'll need to see the actual ledgers before I can give you a proper assessment," she said, closing her notebook. "And I'd want to speak with your foreman and whoever currently manages your supplier relationships. But based on what you've described, I think there's a significant amount of money being lost through inefficiency, and at least one situation that sounds like it may be something more deliberate." "Deliberate," Ethan repeated. "I don't want to use a stronger word until I've seen the documentation," Margaret said carefully. "But the pattern you're describing with your grain supplier is one I've seen before, and it rarely turns out to be innocent." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You're talking about theft," he said. "I'm saying I want to look at the records before I draw conclusions." "If you found evidence of theft," Ethan said, "among my suppliers or my own staff, what would you do with that information?" Margaret looked at him with an expression of mild surprise, as if the question were simpler than he was making it. "I'd bring it to you," she said. "You're the employer. That's your decision to make, not mine." He looked at her. She looked back. "What are your terms?" he said. She told him. They were reasonable. More than reasonable, in fact. The wage she quoted was fair without being ambitious, and the lodging she requested was modest. She was not negotiating from a position of confidence, and she knew it, and she had priced accordingly. What she had, instead of leverage, was a clear statement of what she would deliver and an obvious competence that spoke for itself. Ethan Walker was a man who had made his living reading cattle and weather and the particular quality of silence that precedes a storm. He had not applied those same skills to the reading of people because the reading of people led to caring about them, and he had decided some years ago that caring about people was a form of risk he could no longer afford. But he looked at Margaret Doyle across a table full of empty lemonade glasses in the heat of a Montana summer afternoon, and something in the way she held herself direct, practical, entirely uninterested in performing anything for his benefit, made him think that perhaps this was a risk he could manage. 60 days, he said. Trial arrangement. I'll cover your wage and provide lodging in the main house, separate quarters. At the end of 60 days, we assess whether the arrangement should continue. That's acceptable, Margaret said. You can start Monday, he said. The ranch is 2 hours north of here. You'll need your own transportation. I'll arrange it. She gathered her notebook and pencil and returned them to her satchel. She extended her hand in the businesslike manner that she had extended hands to clients and employers her entire professional life. And Ethan Walker, after a fraction of a second's hesitation that she pretended not to notice, shook it. I'll see you Monday, Mr. Walker, she said. Monday. He agreed. She nodded once, adjusted the strap of her satchel, and walked back into the fair. He watched her go. Clara Hennessy, who had been watching from a discreet distance for the better part of an hour, and whose patience had finally run out, appeared at his left shoulder with the expression of someone who has just witnessed an event they cannot adequately categorize. Ethan, she said. Was that woman, did you just... I hired an accountant, Ethan said. He said it in the flat, matter-of-fact tone of a man who is not inviting discussion, and he walked back toward the cattle auction, and Clara Hennessy was left standing alone in the heat, trying to understand what had just happened. She would not be the last person in Caldwell Creek to find herself in that position. Margaret arrived on Monday morning at 7 o'clock. She arrived in a rented wagon with a single trunk and her satchel and a calm professional demeanor that not one person on that ranch knew entirely what to do with. The ranch hands watched her climb down from the wagon with expressions ranging from puzzled to skeptical. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Agnes, who had managed the Walker household for 11 years and had developed strong opinions about most things, appeared on the porch and looked Margaret over with the particular thoroughness of a woman who intends to form a judgment and stick to it. You're the accountant, Agnes said. Margaret Doyle. Margaret confirmed. She extended her hand. Agnes shook it briefly without warmth. The study's through the main hall, second door on the left. The ledgers go back 7 years. I'll show you where things are. I appreciate that, Margaret said. Agnes showed her where things were with the minimum possible number of words, and Margaret thanked her for each item shown. And by mid-morning, she was seated at the desk in the study with 7 years of ranch financial records spread out around her, and a cup of coffee at her elbow, and a look of focused concentration on her face that would remain there more or less for the next 3 days. Ethan came to the study doorway at noon on the first day, expecting he was not entirely sure what he expected. Some sign that she was overwhelmed, perhaps. Some request for clarification or assistance that would confirm the efficiency of the records keeping had been adequate after all. What he found was Margaret cross-referencing 3 separate ledgers simultaneously, with notes accumulating in her own notebook at a rate that suggested she had already found something. She looked up when she heard his step. The grain supplier, she said without preamble. Harlan and Sons, you've been paying their invoices without verifying the delivery quantities. Ethan paused. The foreman signs off on deliveries. Your foreman, Margaret said, setting down her pencil with a careful, controlled movement, has been signing off on deliveries that don't match what was actually received. The discrepancy in the last 18 months alone is significant. She named a figure. Ethan went very still. How significant? He said. She said the number again. That's... It's theft, Margaret said quietly. I didn't want to use that word until I was certain. I'm certain. The silence that followed had a particular quality to it. The kind of silence that happens when something you suspected but refused to fully acknowledge is finally confirmed by someone else's words. My foreman, Ethan said. His voice was flat in a way that was not calm but was managing itself with considerable effort. Tom Briggs has been with me for 6 years. I know, Margaret said. And I'm not the evidence is in the records, Mr. Walker. I'll show you everything I've found. But this is your decision. Whatever you choose to do, I'll support it. That's what you've hired me for. He walked into the study and stood beside the desk, and she showed him everything. It took 2 hours. By the end of those 2 hours, Ethan Walker had learned that his grain supplier had been billing him for 15% more than was delivered for the better part of 2 years, and that his foreman, Tom Briggs, had been receiving a portion of the difference, and that the loss over the full period was enough to have funded the expansion of the South pasture he had been putting off for 3 years because he thought he couldn't afford it. He had also learned in a different and less quantifiable way that the woman sitting across the desk from him did not flinch. She laid out what she had found clearly, without drama, without any apparent desire to alarm him or to make herself important by being the one who had found it. She was simply doing the job she had said she would do, and she was doing it with a precision and a steadiness that he found against his expectations profoundly impressive. I'll deal with Briggs today, he said when she finished. Do you want me to prepare a written summary of the evidence? Margaret asked. In case the matter proceeds to any kind of formal process. He looked at her. Yes, he said. Do that. She nodded and returned to her notes. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he left. Miss Doyle, he said. She looked up. Good work, he said. It was not eloquent. It was not elaborate. But he said it as if he meant it with the directness of a man who doesn't spend words he doesn't intend. Thank you, she said. She said it the same way, simply without performance. He left. She went back to the ledgers. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the payroll structure, identified 2 additional supplier discrepancies that turned out to be errors rather than deliberate fraud, and produced a written summary of recommended changes to the ranch's purchasing process that would, if implemented, save a predictable and significant amount annually. She left the summary on the desk in the study with a note saying she was available to discuss it at his convenience. Ethan read it that evening, alone in the lamplight. He read it twice. The recommendations were not complicated. They were logical, practical, and had the particular quality of advice given by someone who has no stake in impressing you, who is simply telling you as directly as possible what the situation actually is and what would actually help. He set the papers down. He sat for a long time in the lamplight. At some point during the silence, something shifted in him that he would not have been able to name in the moment and would take months to properly understand. It was the first time in 5 years that someone had helped him, not offered to help him, not performed the idea of helping him in the hope of getting something from him in return. Actually helped him with something real, with something that mattered, without asking for anything except what had been agreed between them. He did not know, sitting there in the lamplight, what to do with that feeling, but he registered it. Outside, somewhere in the direction of the bunkhouse, someone was playing a harmonica. The music drifted through the warm Montana night, thin and sweet, and a little melancholy, and Ethan Walker sat with a woman's careful handwriting spread across the desk in front of him and realized that the house did not feel quite as empty as it usually did. He was not sure whether that frightened him or not. He decided provisionally that it did not matter. He folded the summary, set it in the drawer where he kept important papers, and went to bed. The following week, Margaret began the work of restructuring the supplier contracts. This required her to travel into Caldwell Creek twice to meet with 2 of the suppliers whose agreements she intended to renegotiate, and it required a steadiness of nerve that she had both as a professional and as a woman operating in a world that was not always inclined to take her seriously. The first supplier, a man named Garrett, who ran the hardware provisioning for the ranch, looked at her across his counter with the particular expression that men wore when they were deciding whether to take instructions from a woman. "Mr. Walker sent you," he said. "Mr. Walker authorized me to handle this negotiation," Margaret said pleasantly. "The current contract has several terms that are unfavorable to the ranch. I've prepared a revised version that I think you'll find reasonable." She placed the document on the counter. Garrett looked at the document. He looked at Margaret. He picked up the document and read it. He was quiet for a moment. "This cuts my margin by 12%, he said. "Your current margin," Margaret said, "includes a 3% overcharge that has been consistent for the last 4 years. The revised rate accounts for that adjustment while maintaining a fair return on your actual costs. I've done the calculations if you'd like to see them." Garrett stared at her. "Walker know about the 3%, he said. "He does now," Margaret said. Another silence. Then Garrett picked up the pen on his counter and signed the revised contract. "You're a hard woman," he said. It was not exactly a compliment. "I'm a fair one," Margaret said, taking the signed contract and returning it carefully to her satchel. "There's a difference." She walked out into the summer heat and back to her wagon, and she permitted herself only when she was out of view of the hardware store a small expression of satisfaction. Not pride, just the particular quiet pleasure of work done well. Back at the ranch, she reported to Ethan. He listened to the account of the Garrett negotiation with an expression that she was beginning to be able to read slightly, the controlled stillness of a man who is responding internally more than he is showing. "He signed," Ethan said. "He signed," Margaret confirmed. Ethan nodded slowly. "And the grain supplier?" "Meetings arranged for Thursday." He was quiet for a moment. "The grain supplier knows you're coming?" he asked. "He knows a representative of the Walker Ranch is coming to discuss a contract revision," Margaret said. "He doesn't know what that revision contains." She paused. "I prefer to have those conversations in person." Something moved in Ethan's expression, not quite a smile, but the closest approximation of one she had seen on him. "I'll come Thursday," he said. She looked at him mildly surprised. "You don't need to," she said. "I can—" "I know you can," Ethan said. "I want to be there." She understood then what he was actually saying. That he wanted to witness the conversation not because he doubted her competence, but because he had spent 6 years being managed around by people he trusted, and he intended going forward to be present. "All right," she said. "Thursday at 10. On Thursday they drove into Caldwell Creek together in the ranch wagon, Ethan driving Margaret with her satchel and her notebook, both of them largely silent, in the comfortable way that people who have been working alongside each other are sometimes silent. The meeting with the grain supplier, a florid-faced man named Harlan Sr., whose son, Harlan Jr., managed the actual deliveries, went considerably less smoothly than the Garrett negotiation. Harlan Sr. When presented with the evidence of the delivery discrepancies and the revised contract terms, went through several stages of reaction in rapid succession. First, denial. Then, the particular variety of outrage that is performed by people who have been caught doing something and are attempting to reframe the catching as an offense. "You're calling me a thief," Harlan said, his face darkening. "I'm presenting you with documentation," Margaret said. The documentation shows consistent discrepancies between invoiced quantities and received quantities over a period of 18 months. What you call that is your own business. "These are accounting errors," Harlan said. "All of them in the same direction," Margaret said. "Over 18 months with a consistent percentage." Harlan looked at Ethan. It was the look of a man appealing to another man over the head of the woman who has inconveniently done her job. "Ethan," Harlan said, "we've done business for 7 years. You're going to sit there and let this woman—" "I'm going to sit here," Ethan said in the flat final voice of a man who is done with a particular conversation, "and let my financial manager finish explaining our revised terms, which you'll sign. Or you won't, and we'll take our business to Mackenzie's in Billings, and we'll file the documentation we have with the county office on our way through." Harlan's expression went through another rapid series of changes. Silence. He signed. In the wagon on the way back, neither of them spoke for several miles. Then Margaret said, "Thank you." Ethan looked at the road ahead. "You didn't need it," he said. "I know," she said. "But you did it anyway." He was quiet again. "It was the right thing to do," he finally said. She did not respond to that. But she was looking at the road ahead with an expression that, if someone had been watching her carefully enough, might have been the beginning of something she was not prepared to name yet. She did not name it. She looked at the road. The wagon moved through the summer heat, and the prairie opened around them, wide and golden and indifferent, and somewhere between the town and the ranch, something small and durable was being built between two people who were both trying with considerable effort not to build anything at all. The 60-day arrangement had been Ethan's idea, and he had framed it in his own mind as a practical decision. A business trial. Nothing more subject to termination. At any point, either party found it unsatisfactory. He had made this clear to himself with some deliberateness, because Ethan Walker was a man who had learned in the hardest possible way that the most dangerous things in life were the ones you didn't name accurately from the beginning. He named this accurately a professional engagement. 60 days. Finite. What he had not named, because he had not yet seen it clearly enough to name, it was the degree to which the presence of another person, a specific particular person, going about her work with that particular quality of focused, unperforming competence, was already changing the texture of daily life at the ranch. It started with small things. Breakfast, which Ethan had been taking alone at the kitchen table for 5 years, with a cup of coffee and whatever Agnes left for him, was now occasionally taken with Margaret, who arrived in the kitchen at approximately the same time. Most mornings poured her own coffee without asking anyone's assistance, and either sat with her notebook open and her attention entirely absorbed in whatever she was working through, or sat across from him and asked him direct practical questions about the ranch's operations. She never asked how he was feeling. She never attempted to soften the morning with small talk designed to put him at ease. She either had something specific to discuss or she did not, and if she did not, the silence between them was the kind of silence that requires nothing. Ethan Walker had not experienced that variety of silence with another human being in 5 years. He had not realized he missed it until he had it again. By the end of the 3rd week, she had restructured every active supplier contract on the property, reorganized the payroll into a system that his remaining ranch hands understood clearly, and produced a cash flow projection for the next 6 months. That was when Ethan read it both more honest and more optimistic than anything he had managed on his own. More optimistic because it was honest. Because it accounted for the money that had been leaking out through Briggs and Harlan and the dozen small inefficiencies that had accumulated over years of a man trying to run everything himself. When you stopped the leaking, there was more water in the basin than you'd thought. Tom Briggs had been let go on the Monday after Margaret's discovery, quietly without spectacle, with 2 weeks' wages, and a very clear understanding from Ethan of what would and would not be discussed publicly about the reasons. Ethan had conducted that conversation alone, and afterward he had come back to the study where Margaret was working and stood in the doorway for a moment and said nothing. She had looked up. "Done," she said. "Done," he said. She nodded. "There's a man named Peterson who's been your underboss for the last 3 years," she said. "Based on the payroll records, he's the most reliable worker you have. You might consider whether to move him up." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You can tell that from payroll records," he said. "I can tell it from 3 weeks of watching who gets asked for things when there's a problem," Margaret said. "The payroll just told me he's been here long enough to know how everything works." Ethan looked at her with the particular expression she had come to recognize. Not quite surprise, because she had stopped surprising him in the way she had initially surprised him, but something that was still adjusting to the experience of a person who noticed things. "I'll talk to Peterson," he said. "Good," she said, and returned to her work. He promoted Peterson that same week. Within 3 days, the difference in the bunkhouse was palpable. The ranch hands worked with more confidence. Disagreements were resolved faster, and Ethan found himself fielding a significantly smaller number of minor operational questions that had previously taken up more of his day than he had realized. He had more time. He did not initially know what to do with it. He found himself on a Thursday afternoon standing at the fence of the south pasture, doing nothing in particular for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, and the feeling was disorienting enough that he stood there for several minutes, simply adjusting to it. "You look like a man who doesn't know what to do when there's nothing catastrophic happening," said a voice behind him. He turned. Margaret was walking across the yard with her satchel over one shoulder and 2 cups of coffee, which was sufficiently unusual that he registered it with visible surprise. "Agnes asked if I'd bring this out," she said, handing him a cup. "She seemed to feel you'd been on your feet since 5. "It's 3 in the afternoon," Ethan said. "That's a long time to be on your feet." He accepted the coffee. She stood beside him at the fence and looked out at the south pasture with the same assessing expression she turned on everything. "That pasture's underused," she said. "I haven't had the capital to develop it properly." "You will," she said. "By end of summer if the fall cattle numbers hold." He looked at her. "You're sure," he said. "The projection assumes no catastrophic losses and no new unexpected costs," she said. "But barring that, yes. You'll have the capital for the south pasture expansion you've been putting off." She paused. "And the new water system for the east barn." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been planning that water system for 4 years," he said. "I know," she said. "It's in the notes you made in the back of the 83 ledger." He stared at her. "You read the notes in the back of the 83 ledger," he said. "I read everything," Margaret said. "That's the job." He looked back at the south pasture. She stood beside him with her coffee, and neither of them said anything for several minutes, and the silence had that particular quality, again the kind that doesn't require filling, that exists comfortably between people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. Then Margaret said quietly, as if she were thinking out loud more than addressing him directly, "You've been managing this whole operation alone for a long time." It was not a question. "Since Rebecca left," he said. He said the name without planning to, and then registered that he had said it, and the registration produced a slight stiffening in his posture. Margaret did not react to the name the way everyone else did, with the sudden careful blankness of someone navigating around a dangerous subject. She just said, "Before that too, I imagine. That kind of a loan doesn't start with one event." Ethan looked at her. "You're very direct," he said. His voice was neutral, not offended, just observing. "You hired me because I'm direct," she said. "You can tell me to mind my own business if you prefer." A pause. "It's fine," he said. She nodded once and drank her coffee. "My father was the same way," she said after a moment. "After my mother died, he didn't stop functioning. He kept working, kept managing, kept everything running perfectly. The farm didn't suffer. The books were always in order." She paused. "But he built the perimeter about 6 inches closer to himself every year. By the time I was 18, there wasn't room for anyone else inside it." Ethan was looking at the pasture. "What happened to him?" he asked. "He died at 62, Margaret said. "His heart gave out. The doctor said it was physical. I've always thought it was the other kind." She was quiet for a beat. "He died very efficiently. Everything in order. No loose ends. And nobody to grieve him properly because there was nobody close enough to know what they'd lost." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable silence of a few minutes ago. It had weight. "I'm not looking for your sympathy," she said in the same direct tone. "I'm saying I recognize the architecture, that's all." Ethan turned to look at her, then a full, direct look, the kind he usually reserved for people he was negotiating with or assessing in some serious capacity. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. Margaret looked back at him with the same steadiness she brought to everything. "Because you asked about my father," she said, "and because honesty is easier than performing casualness when something matters." She took the last sip of her coffee. "I should get back. I want to finish the supply chain review before supper." She took his empty cup without being asked and walked back across the yard. Ethan stood at the fence for a while longer. The south pasture stretched out ahead of him, golden and underused and full of potential that he had been unable to access for 4 years because of money that had been draining away through a crack he hadn't been able to find. He thought about the 83 ledger. He thought about the notes he had made in the back of it in the private shorthand of a man who writes things down, not for anyone else's eyes, but to keep himself honest about what he wants and cannot yet afford. She had read it. She had not mentioned it until it was relevant. She had not used it to perform sympathy or create false intimacy. She had simply filed it in her mind alongside everything else she was tracking and produced it at the correct moment. He walked back toward the ranch house. Something was different in his chest. He was not ready to name it. He decided again provisionally that he did not need to name it yet. The trouble when it arrived did not announce itself. It arrived in the form of a man in a good suit, stepping down from a private carriage in front of the Caldwell Creek Bank on a Wednesday morning in what would turn out to be the hottest week of that summer. His name was Charles Whitmore, and he was accompanied by 2 other men in somewhat less good suits, who carried between them the general demeanor of people whose job is to stand near someone important and look as though they would be willing to cause a problem if required. Whitmore was in his mid-40s, well-fed in the specific way of a man who eats well as a demonstration of his status, and he carried himself with the comfortable authority of someone who had never in recent memory been told a definitive no, and allowed to remain no. He was a land investor. More specifically, he was the advance man for a consortium that was acquiring land parcels along the projected route of the Northern Pacific Railroad's Montana expansion land that would quadruple in value the moment the tracks came through, which they would within 18 months, according to information that Whitmore had obtained through channels that were not entirely above reproach. Ethan Walker's ranch sat at the precise center of the most valuable section of that route. Whitmore sent a letter first. It was cordial, admiring, and contained an offer that was, he explained carefully, considerably above current market value for the property, reflecting the railroad's projected trajectory and Whitmore's personal confidence in the region's future. Ethan read the letter on a Friday morning at the kitchen table with his coffee, and the kind of focused expressionlessness that meant something specific was happening internally. Margaret, who had developed a working familiarity with that expression, set down her own cup. "Bad news," she said. He handed her the letter. She read it. Her expression went through a brief but visible sequence of reactions: recognition, assessment, calculation before settling into the particular stillness of someone who has just identified a problem. "You're not going to sell," she said. It was not a question. "No," Ethan said. "He'll come back," she said. "They always come back when the first offer is ignored." "I know. Have you had other inquiries like this? Other buyers interested in this specific property?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "2. In the last year. Neither of them was as formal as this." Margaret set the letter on the table. "Railroad expansion," she said. "Northern Pacific. The route's been speculated for 2 years. If Whitmore's moved from speculation to acquisition letters, the route is confirmed or very nearly." She looked at him. "Your land is worth significantly more than he's offering." "I know that too." "Do your neighbors know?" she asked. The question landed differently than a simple question. He looked at her. "Some of them are getting the same letters," he said slowly. "Garrison, Aldrich, probably the Perrys. And they may not know the land is worth more than what's being offered," Margaret said. "If the route is confirmed and Whitmore gets enough of the parcels under contract before word gets out about the actual valuation—" She stopped, picked up the letter again, read a specific line. "He's including a time pressure. The offer remains available through the end of the summer season. That's a compression tactic." "You've seen this before," Ethan said. "In Helena. Smaller scale, same structure." She set the letter down. "The goal isn't necessarily to buy your land specifically. The goal is to buy enough land along the route at below value prices before the railroad announcement makes the real value public. If he gets half the parcels on the route under contract in the next 8 weeks, the neighbors who haven't signed will have no leverage. There'll be isolated sections surrounded by Whitmore's holdings, and he'll reduce the offer. Ethan looked at her steadily. "How do you know all this?" he said. "Silas Pratt, my last employer, was approached the same way in '74, she said. He didn't recognize the pattern in time, lost the building that had been in his family for 20 years. Her voice was level. "I recognized the pattern when I saw it happen to someone I respected. I don't forget patterns." A beat of silence. "What would you recommend?" Ethan said. "Talk to your neighbors," Margaret said. "Not formally, just neighbor to neighbor. Find out who's received letters, what the offers said, whether anyone's already signed. And don't respond to Whitmore yet. Not yes, not no. Silence costs you nothing right now, and it keeps your options open." Ethan nodded. "I'll ride out to Garrison's today," he said. "Do you want me to come?" He considered it for a moment. "Not today," he said. "I need to have that conversation man to man first. But if there's a way to help the neighbors understand the financial picture—" "I can prepare a summary," she said. "A plain language document showing the railroad route value projections against what the letters are likely offering. Something they can actually understand without a financial background. Can you have it by the weekend? I can have it by tomorrow evening." Ethan was already rising from the table. He stopped, looked at her. "Margaret," he said. She looked up. "I don't know what I would have done with that letter if you hadn't been here," he said. It was the kind of sentence a man like Ethan Walker said once and did not repeat, and they both understood that. "You would have refused the offer," she said. "You were never going to sell." "No," he said. "But I might have refused it and thought it was only about me. I wouldn't have thought about Garrison and Aldrich." She held his gaze for a moment. "That's why 2 heads are better than 1, she said. Her voice was steady, but something in her eyes was not entirely steady, and she looked back down at the letter before he could see it clearly enough to identify it. He left. She sat at the table for a few minutes longer than she needed to with her coffee cooling in her hands. She was thinking about something she had decided quite firmly not to think about. She went back to work. The summary document she produced by Friday evening was clear, concise, and designed for someone with no financial training to understand in a single reading. It laid out the railroad route projections, the realistic land value given that route, the structure of the acquisition strategy. Whitmore's letter represented, and a plain language explanation of why accepting the first offer, or any offer made before the public announcement, would mean selling at a fraction of what the land would be worth within 2 years. Ethan took it to Garrison's on Saturday. He came back Sunday evening looking like a man who has had a longer conversation than he expected. "Garrison's already signed a letter of intent," he said when he found Margaret in the study. She looked up. "How long ago?" 3 weeks. "Is it a binding contract or a letter of intent?" "Letter of intent. He hasn't received the formal contract yet." "Then he may still be able to withdraw," she said, "depending on the language of the letter." She held out her hand. "Do you have it?" He gave me a copy. Ethan produced a folded paper from his jacket. She read it. "There's a 5-day withdrawal window from the date of the formal contract," she said, "which he hasn't received yet." She looked up. "If he withdraws before signing the formal contract, he's not bound. He needs to do it in writing delivered to Whitmore's office." "You're sure?" "I'm sure of what this document says. I'd want a lawyer to confirm before he acts on it, but this is standard land agreement language and it's clear." She paused. "How many others?" "Aldrich says he's received the letter but hasn't responded. Perry too. Henderson's letter came last week and he's considering." "So Garrison is the only one who's moved toward signing," Margaret said. "That's recoverable. Barely, but recoverable." She began writing. She wrote for 3 hours that evening, a revised version of the summary document tailored to Garrison's specific situation, a template withdrawal letter with instructions, and an expanded version of the neighborhood briefing document that accounted for each individual ranch's land parcel and its specific relationship to the projected route. Ethan sat in the study with her and didn't speak much. But he was there, and that had its own quality, the quality of a man who has decided to be present for something instead of managing it from a distance. At one point, around 9 o'clock, Agnes appeared in the doorway with bread and cold meat and 2 more cups of coffee, set them on the side table without comment, and left. Ethan looked at the food. "Agnes doesn't usually do that," he said. "She did it last Tuesday too," Margaret said without looking up from her writing. "When we were working late on the payroll revisions." "She doesn't like you," Ethan said. "She doesn't know me," Margaret said. "She's deciding." She looked up briefly. "She likes you, and she can see that the work is helping, so she brings food." She returned to her writing. "Let her decide on her own schedule. People usually come around when they stop feeling threatened." Ethan ate his bread in silence. "Do you always know why people are doing what they're doing?" he asked. Margaret considered this. "Not always," she said. "But I pay attention. Most people tell you everything you need to know about what they're feeling if you watch them long enough. They can't help it." She paused. "You do it too." "Do what?" he said. "Tell people things you don't mean to tell them." She kept her eyes on her writing. "When you're working through something difficult, you go very quiet at meals. Not just your usual quiet, a different quality of it. And you check the south pasture fence after supper, even when there's nothing wrong with the south pasture fence, because walking helps you think." A long silence. "I didn't realize that was visible," Ethan said finally. "I suspect most things are more visible than we want them to be," Margaret said. She finished the paragraph she was writing, set down her pen, looked at him directly. "You've been checking the south pasture fence a lot this week," she said, "since the letter came." His jaw tightened slightly. "The land," he said. "This ranch. It's the one thing I built from nothing after—" He stopped. "It's the one thing I know is mine." She looked at him. "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I'm going to make sure nobody takes it from you." The words sat in the room between them with a weight that neither of them acknowledged directly. Then Margaret picked up her pen and went back to writing. And Ethan Walker ate the rest of his bread in the lamplight and watched her work, and did not check the south pasture fence that evening, because for the first time in a long time, there was someone else in the room who was paying attention. Charles Whitmore arrived in Caldwell Creek the following week. His carriage was visible from half a mile out, the specific kind of vehicle that is designed to be visible from half a mile out. He checked into the only hotel in town and hosted a dinner that same evening for several of the area's prominent landowners and businessmen, at which the food was excellent, and the conversation carefully shaped to leave everyone present with the impression that the railroad deal was already settled, and the only question was whether they would be inside it or outside it. Word reached the ranch by noon the next day. Agnes, who had a sister whose husband worked at the hotel, was the source. "He's saying the railroad is signing agreements this month," she told Ethan in the kitchen with the focused expression of someone delivering intelligence they consider important. "Says the landowners who don't sign now will lose the value once the route goes public." "He's lying about the timeline," Margaret said. Agnes turned to look at her, the first time she had addressed Margaret directly. "How do you know?" Agnes said. "Because if the agreements were being signed this month, he wouldn't be hosting dinners," Margaret said. "He'd be filing documents. The dinner is theater. He needs people to feel pressure, so he's manufacturing urgency." She paused. "The real timeline is probably 6 to 8 weeks before the route announcement. He wants contracts signed before then." Agnes looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Ethan. "She's right," Agnes said. "I think she probably is," Ethan said. Agnes looked at Margaret again with a slightly different expression. Not warmth, exactly, but the beginning of something adjacent to respect. "He's having breakfast at the hotel tomorrow morning," Agnes said. "Open invitation. Several of the ranchers are going." "Then we should go," Margaret said. Ethan looked at her. "We," he said. "He doesn't know who I am, or what I know," Margaret said. And it would be useful to watch him work a room before he tries it on you directly. She met Ethan's eyes. He'll try to speak with you alone eventually. He'll offer more than the letter. He always does when the first offer is refused. It'll be useful to understand his tactics before that conversation happens. Ethan was quiet for a beat. You want to go to Whitmore's breakfast and watch him operate, he said. I want to go to Whitmore's breakfast and understand exactly what we're dealing with, she said. He'll be unpleasant to you, Ethan said, when he understands who you are and why you're there. Men like Whitmore. He stopped. I know what men like Whitmore do, Margaret said evenly. I'd rather know it in a public setting than discover it later in a situation I can't manage. She held his gaze. I can handle unpleasant Mr. Walker. I've been handling it most of my professional life. Ethan looked at her for a moment. All right, he said. We'll go. The breakfast at the Caldwell Creek Hotel was the kind of event that announced itself as casual while being meticulously orchestrated. Tables arranged for conversation. Food that was better than the hotel usually produced. Whitmore moving through the room with the specific social fluency of a man who has done this many times before, who knows exactly when to laugh, when to listen, when to lower his voice for the particular effect of apparent confidence. He noticed Margaret the moment Ethan brought her in. Not in the way a man notices an attractive woman, in the way a man notices something that does not fit the picture he has arranged. He recovered immediately the recovery of a professional and came toward them with his hand extended. Walker, he said. Glad you came. His eyes moved to Margaret with the same quick, dismissive assessment she had seen 1,000 times, the one that categorized and moved on. And this is Margaret Doyle, Margaret said before Ethan could introduce her. Financial manager, Walker Ranch. Something shifted in Whitmore's expression. Barely visible. Miss Doyle, he said. I don't believe I've seen you at events like this before. I haven't been in the area long, she said pleasantly. Well. He smiled, and it was a practice smile that contained nothing. I hope you're enjoying Montana. He moved on. She watched him work the room for the next 40 minutes. She watched how he positioned the conversations, always framing the railroad as a certainty, always positioning the offer as a favor. He was doing the landowners rather than a deal. He needed always applying just enough social pressure to make disagreement feel like bad manners rather than a legitimate position. She watched who responded to which tactics. Garrison, who had already signed the letter of intent, watched Whitmore with the anxious expression of a man hoping he had made the right choice. Henderson was leaning in the body language of someone who wants to be convinced. Perry sat back and said little, which meant he was either deeply skeptical or playing his cards carefully. She filed all of it. At one point across the room, she caught Whitmore looking at her. Not with the dismissive glance of the beginning, but with a more focused attention, the attention of a man recalibrating. He had understood in the interval that she was not a decorative addition to Ethan's morning, but something with a function, and the understanding had slightly altered the way he was holding the room. Good, she thought. Let him think about it. She said nothing to Ethan during the breakfast, not wishing to be seen conferring. But when they stepped out into the morning air afterward and walked to the wagon, she began talking almost immediately, and by the time they reached the edge of town, she had given him a complete analysis of everything she had observed. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, Henderson. Henderson will sign unless someone gives him a reason not to, she said. He's not convinced yet, but he's close. He needs the information in the document, the actual value comparison, and he needs someone he trusts to tell him it's reliable. I'll go to Henderson this afternoon, Ethan said. He trusts you, Margaret said. That matters more than the document. The document just gives him something concrete to hold on to. They drove in silence for a moment. Then Ethan said without looking at her, Whitmore watched you for most of the last half hour. I know, she said. He's going to find out what you've been doing here, Ethan said. What you've uncovered, what you've helped me do with the supplier contracts, the impact on the negotiations. He'll find out. Word travels. I know that too, she said. When he does, Ethan said, he'll come after you specifically. Men like Whitmore don't attack the argument, they attack the person making it. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said for the third time. She said it in the way that meant, I have accounted for this risk, and I am still here. She said it without drama or performance, in the same steady voice in which she said everything. Ethan gripped the reins a little tighter than the road required. I won't let that happen, he said. The words came out before he had decided to say them. She looked at him. He looked at the road. Neither of them said anything for the rest of the drive back. But something had moved between them that was harder to ignore than anything that had moved between them before, and they both knew it, and neither of them was quite ready for what knowing it meant. Henderson signed with Ethan's copy of the summary document folded in his breast pocket, and a handshake that lasted longer than necessary, the kind of handshake a man gives when he is thanking you for something he cannot quite put into words. His wife stood in the doorway of the house and watched them go with an expression that Margaret, sitting in the wagon, recognized as relief so profound it had hollowed the woman's face into something younger and more fragile than she probably allowed herself to look in public. They had cut it close. Whitmore's man had been at Henderson's property that same morning, 2 hours before Ethan arrived with a revised offer and a contract already prepared. Henderson had not signed it. He had told the man he needed time, which Whitmore's representative had spent 20 minutes explaining he did not have, and which Henderson had politely refused to accept, and which had left the man driving away with the unsigned contract, and Henderson standing on his porch with the particular expression of someone who knows they have just made a decision but is not entirely certain it was the right one. Then Ethan had arrived, and Margaret had laid the document on Henderson's kitchen table and walked him through every line of it while Henderson's wife brought coffee and leaned over her husband's shoulder to read along. And by the end of it, Henderson had the expression of a man who has been handed a lamp in a dark room. Not that everything was resolved, but that he could finally see where he was standing. You're sure about the value, Henderson had said, looking at the numbers. I'm sure about the calculation, Margaret had said. The railroad route is the variable I can't fully confirm, but the letters Whitmore is sending assume a confirmed route, or he wouldn't be moving this fast. If I were wrong about the route, he wouldn't be here. Henderson had looked at Ethan. You trust her on this, he had said. Ethan had answered without hesitating. Completely, he had said. It was the first time he had used that word about anyone in longer than he could accurately remember, and it came out of him with a certainty that surprised him slightly, and he filed that surprise in the back of his mind and did not examine it immediately because there were more pressing things to attend to. But it was there. On the drive back from Henderson's, Margaret was quiet in a different way than her usual working quiet. She was looking at the road ahead with the expression of someone whose mind is running several problems in parallel. Whitmore was there this morning, she said, 2 hours before us. Which means he already knows we've been talking to the neighbors. She was still looking at the road. He has someone watching, or someone talking. Ethan thought about it. The hotel, he said. Agnes's sister. Maybe, or one of the ranch hands. Word travels faster than wagons in a small territory. She paused. It doesn't change what we need to do, but it means we have less time than I thought. How much less? He'll make his move within the week, she said. He can't afford to let us keep working the neighborhood. Every day we're talking to ranchers he's losing ground. She was right. She was right by approximately 3 days. Whitmore's first move was social, and it was elegant in the specific way that cruelty can be elegant when it is practiced by someone with resources and patience. It started at the general store. Mildred Paxton, who ran the store with her husband, and who was the central nervous system of Caldwell Creek's information network, mentioned to 2 customers on a Wednesday morning that she had heard something about the Walker Ranch. Something about Ethan Walker keeping company with a woman who had arrived with no references worth verifying and a history that might bear some looking into. She mentioned it with the particular air of someone who is sharing a concern, rather than a rumor, which was the most effective possible delivery. By Thursday, the shape of the story had shifted slightly in transit, the way stories do. By Thursday, it was less about Margaret's references, and more about the general question of why Ethan Walker, who had shown no interest in any of the eligible women in the county, had installed a woman from out of town in his house, and what exactly the nature of that arrangement was. The version that reached Margaret directly came from Agnes on Thursday evening in the kitchen, delivered with the blunt efficiency of a woman who believed in stating things plainly. "They're talking about you in town," Agnes said. Margaret set down the cup she was holding. "What are they saying?" she said. Agnes told her. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "And Mr. Walker," she said. "What are they saying about him?" "That he's making a fool of himself," Agnes said. "That a man in his position—" She stopped, started again. "They're being unkind." "I understand," Margaret said. "Thank you for telling me." Agnes looked at her with an expression that had completed its journey from suspicion to something considerably warmer without announcing the arrival. "You're not going to do anything about it," Agnes said. "What would you suggest I do?" Margaret asked. "I'd suggest giving some people a piece of your mind," Agnes said. "That would satisfy me for approximately 10 minutes, Margaret said, "and give them a reason to dismiss everything we've been working on." She picked up her cup again. "The best response to a rumor is a result. We keep working." Agnes looked at her for a long moment. "You're a different kind of woman," Agnes said. It was not a simple compliment, but it was not an insult either. It was an observation from someone who had spent 11 years in this house watching a different kind of damage accumulate. "I've been told that before," Margaret said. She told Ethan that evening. She told him matter-of-factly, "The way she reported everything here is the information. Here is my assessment. Here is my recommendation." She did not perform distress, and she did not minimize it. She laid it out cleanly and watched his face as she did. His face did what it did when something hit a nerve that he had trained himself not to show, went very still the way still water conceals depth. "Who started it?" he said. His voice was even, but the evenness required effort. "I don't know for certain. I suspect Whitmore or someone working on his behalf. It's too well timed to be coincidence." Ethan was quiet. "I'll go into town tomorrow," he said, "and say what she said. That it's a professional arrangement. That anyone suggesting otherwise is mistaken. That confirms the story is worth discussing," she said. "It keeps it alive." She looked at him. "The most effective thing you can do right now is nothing. Continue as normal. Don't defend, don't deny, don't engage. Let it run its course." "While they say those things about you," he said. The evenness in his voice had developed a fault line. "While they say things that are inaccurate and unkind and that will matter considerably less than the outcome of what we're working on," she said. "Ethan, in 6 weeks, either the land stays in the hands of the ranchers, who should have it, or it doesn't. That's what matters. Not what Mildred Paxton says over the dry goods counter." He looked at her. "You're asking me to let it go," he said. "I'm asking you to stay focused on what's actually important." A long silence. "I don't like it," he said. "I know you don't," she said. "I'm not asking you to like it." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he looked away toward the window with the expression of a man overriding something in himself through deliberate effort. "Fine," he said. It was the hardest single syllable she had heard him produce. She recognized it for what it was. Not surrender, discipline. The county landowners' meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, a regular quarterly gathering that had been arranged before Whitmore's arrival, and that now had a specific additional weight, because Whitmore had sent word through intermediaries that he intended to attend. Margaret spent the weekend preparing. Not just documents this time. She had been thinking about what Whitmore would do in that room, and she had been thinking about it with the same focused intensity she brought to a ledger that didn't balance, running the columns, testing the assumptions, identifying where the numbers wanted to deceive you. Whitmore would not lead with the offer at the meeting. He would lead with vision. He would talk about the railroad, about what it meant for the region, about prosperity and progress and the future of Montana Territory, and he would make selling feel like participation rather than surrender. He would appeal to pride and ambition and the particular longing of men who had worked hard in a difficult place and wanted to see that work recognized. And then when the room was warm with possibility, he would make the offer again, and this time it would not feel like a lowball. It would feel like a fair share of something larger than themselves. That was the architecture. She needed to dismantle it in a way that did not feel like an attack, because the moment she attacked Whitmore directly, she would become the villain of the room, and he would become the aggrieved party, and everything she had to say would be filtered through the social question of who she was and what right she had to say it. She spent 3 days thinking about how to do this, and she was still thinking about it on Sunday evening when Ethan found her in the study at 10 o'clock with every piece of documentation they had spread across the desk and an expression of deep concentration. He set a cup of coffee next to her without being asked. "Tell me where you are," he said. She told him. He sat down. "He'll bring his own documents," Ethan said. "Projections, maybe testimonials from other landowners who've sold." "Yes. And anyone who hasn't already read ours will be hearing 2 competing sets of numbers," he said. "And they'll default to the one that comes from the more polished presentation. Which is why the numbers alone aren't enough," she said. "The numbers need someone the room trusts." She looked at him. "You." Ethan was quiet. "I'm not a public speaker," he said. "You don't need to be," she said. "You need to stand up in that room and tell the truth in the way that you tell the truth, plainly, without performance. The room knows you. They've known you for years. When you speak, they listen differently than they'd listen to me. You could present the financial case better than I can," he said. "I can," she agreed. "And Whitmore will spend 10 minutes afterward questioning my credentials, my background, and my reasons for being in this room, and half the room will wonder whether he has a point. But if you present it—" She paused. "You're Ethan Walker. Your family has been on this land. Nobody in that room has a reason to question your motives." He looked at the document spread across the desk. "Walk me through it," he said. "All of it. Tonight." She walked him through it. She was still walking him through it at midnight when Agnes appeared in the doorway in her nightdress with an expression of profound exasperation, looked at both of them, said, "There is bread on the counter," and disappeared back down the hall. Ethan looked at the empty doorway. "She's warming up to you," he said. "I know," Margaret said. "She brought extra butter last time." Something caught in his chest, a warmth he didn't reach for but didn't push away. He returned his attention to the documents. By 1 in the morning, he had the financial argument committed to memory in the plain, practical terms that were natural to him. He was not going to be eloquent on Tuesday. He was going to be clear, and that was more dangerous than eloquent. They were gathering the papers when Ethan said without looking up, "What happened to you?" She paused. "What do you mean?" she said. "Your employer died. The business folded. No family left, you said." He looked up. "That's a great deal of loss for 1 year." She was quiet for a moment. "Silas Pratt was a good man," she said. "He hired me when I was 23 and nobody else would because I was a woman, and the job required mathematics, and most men thought that combination was unlikely to work." A pause. "He was wrong about some things. He was a bit sentimental, and he trusted too readily, and he never learned to say no to a request he found sympathetic. But he was good, genuinely good." She set the papers on the desk carefully. "He left me a month's salary in his will. I don't think he thought he was going to die. I think he just liked to be fair. And the family," Ethan said. "My mother died when I was 16, she said. My father when I was 26, no siblings." She said it with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who has had a long time to absorb something. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm telling you because you asked." "Why don't you want sympathy?" he said. It was a direct question asked with genuine curiosity rather than challenge. She thought about it. "Because sympathy is often a way of creating distance," she said. "Someone feels sorry for you, and the feeling satisfies them, and they go away thinking they've done something. I'd rather have one person who actually stays than 20, who are briefly sorry. She looked at him steadily. You asked. That's worth more than sympathy. Ethan held her gaze. He did not say anything for a moment, but something in his expression had shifted to a place she had not seen it go before. Something that was less the controlled stillness of a man managing himself, and more the raw, careful look of a man who has recognized something in another person that he was not prepared to recognize. He looked away first. It's late, he said. Yes, she said. You should sleep. So should you. He gathered his portion of the papers and stood. At the doorway he stopped. Margaret, he said. She looked up. I'm glad you came to the fair, he said. It was quiet and direct and entirely unornamented, and it landed with a weight that a more elaborate statement would not have managed. She looked at him across the desk in the lamplight with 7 years of his financial records reorganized around her, and a county meeting 2 days away, and a man in town actively working to undermine everything she had built here. So am I, she said. He nodded once and left. She sat in the study for a few more minutes alone. She was not thinking about the documents. She pressed that thought down firmly with both hands, the way you press down something that is trying to rise, and she gathered her remaining papers and went to bed. Whitmore moved on Monday. Not publicly. Not yet. He sent a man to the ranch, not himself, which told Margaret everything about how carefully he had calibrated the approach a man named Coles, who wore a suit slightly less good than Whitmore's, and carried a leather folder, and had the polished affability of someone in whom affability had been professionally developed. Agnes came to find Margaret in the study. Man at the door, Agnes said. Says he's here to see you. Me specifically, Margaret said. You specifically, Agnes said. Not Mr. Walker. That was the first thing that was wrong. She went to the door. Coles introduced himself with a card and a smile that was calibrated to communicate reasonableness. Miss Doyle, he said, I'm here on behalf of Mr. Whitmore. He asks whether you'd be willing to have a brief conversation in your professional capacity, of course. Mr. Walker is available if Mr. Whitmore wishes to discuss ranch business, Margaret said pleasantly. Actually? Coles said, Mr. Whitmore was hoping to speak with you about your future plans. There it was. My future plans, she said. You're a talented woman, Coles said. Mr. Whitmore has significant operations throughout the territory, operations that could benefit considerably from someone with your financial skills. The smile again warm and professional. He'd like to discuss whether there might be an arrangement that would be mutually beneficial. She looked at him. He wants to hire me away from the Walker Ranch, she said. He wants to explore possibilities, Coles said. Mr. Whitmore is a generous employer. The compensation would be considerably. Mr. Coles, Margaret said, please tell Mr. Whitmore that I appreciate the inquiry and I'm not available. She paused one beat. And that if he'd like to discuss ranch business, Mr. Walker can be reached through the usual channels. Coles's smile didn't change, but something behind it did. Miss Doyle, he said, I'd encourage you to think carefully. Mr. Whitmore is a man who values people who work with him rather than... I understand, Margaret said. Good morning, Mr. Coles. She closed the door. She stood for a moment in the hallway. Then she went to find Ethan. He was in the barn with Peterson working through something with the horses that required attention, and she waited until there was a natural break, and then said when Peterson had moved off, Whitmore just sent someone to offer me a job. Ethan turned and looked at her with an expression that went through several layers in rapid succession. He sent a man named Coles, she said. The offer was framed as a professional opportunity. The actual purpose was to remove me from the picture before the meeting tomorrow. Ethan's expression had settled on something that was not precisely anger, but was several degrees warmer than she had seen from him before. You said no, he said. It was not quite a question. Of course I said no. He exhaled. He's more worried than I thought, he said. Much more, she said. He sent someone the day before the meeting. That's not a man who has this settled. That's a man who knows he can lose. Something shifted in Ethan's bearing, a quality of resolution settling into place. Then we make sure he does, Ethan said. The county meeting was held in the main hall of the Caldwell Creek Church, which was the largest building available for community gatherings, and which smelled of wood polish and old hymn books, and the specific combination of practical piety and frontier pragmatism that characterized most of the institutions in the territory. 14 ranchers attended, along with several town officials, and the county clerk, who was there because land transactions required his eventual involvement, and who had the slightly harassed expression of a man who prefers paperwork to conflict. Whitmore arrived with Coles and 2 other associates, and he worked the room for 15 minutes before the meeting formally opened, and he was very good at it. He was warm and specific. He remembered names, asked about families, referenced previous conversations, with the precision of a man who had done his research. He made each person he spoke to feel seen and considered, which was an art, and it was working. And Margaret watched it work from her position near the back of the room, with the focused attention of someone who is studying the mechanism of a thing. She was not seated at the front. She had chosen this deliberately. She was there as Ethan's financial advisor, which was accurate, and she had no intention of announcing herself until the correct moment. The meeting was opened by the county commissioner, a broad-shouldered man named Ellsworth, who had the slow, deliberate manner of someone who mistrusts speed. Whitmore spoke first because he had arranged to, and he spoke for 20 minutes, and he was everything Margaret had predicted. The railroad as inevitability, the offer as opportunity, the future of Montana as something these men could be part of or miss. He had documents well prepared and a quiet confidence that communicated success without requiring it to be stated. 3 ranchers were visibly nodding by the time he finished. Henderson was not one of them. Garrison, who still had not received his formal contract, sat with his arms crossed and the expression of a man trying to hold a decision. Then, Commissioner Ellsworth said, "Are there other perspectives to be heard?" Ethan stood up. He did not move to the front immediately. He stood from his seat near the middle of the room, and he said in his usual voice, not loud, not performed, just his voice, which people in that room had been listening to for years, "I've got some numbers I'd like to share." He walked to the front. He presented what Margaret had prepared with the plainness she had hoped for, and the authority that came from being Ethan Walker in a room full of people who had known him for years. He did not editorialize. He did not attack Whitmore directly. He laid out the land value calculations, the railroad route projections, the comparison between the offered price and the realistic value in 18 months, and he said clearly, "I'm not telling you what to do with your land. That's your decision. I'm telling you what the numbers say about what your land is actually worth, so that whatever you decide, you're deciding with the right information." He was not eloquent. He was clear, and in that room on that day, clear was devastating. 3 of the nodding ranchers had stopped nodding. Whitmore stood up. He was still composed. The mark of a professional. "These projections," he said pleasantly, addressing Ethan, but managing the room, "are prepared by whom?" "A financial advisor, I understand. Someone recently arrived in the territory without local knowledge, without, with all respect, a track record in this specific region." He paused, and his eyes moved to the back of the room where Margaret was standing, with the controlled precision of a man who knows exactly where something is, and wants everyone else to look at it too. "I'd ask the room to consider the source of this analysis before weighing it against 20 years of my company's regional experience." The room looked at Margaret. This was the moment she had planned for. She walked forward. She did it calmly, without hurry, without performance, in the way she walked toward everything, with the assurance of someone who has already decided what she is going to do, and does not require the room's permission to do it. She stopped at the front next to Ethan, and she looked at Whitmore directly, and she said, "You're right that I am new to the territory. I'd like to address the question you're raising because I think it's fair." She paused. "My name is Margaret Doyle. I've been managing the Walker Ranch accounts for the past several weeks. In that time, I've recovered significant losses through supplier contract corrections and operational restructuring. I believe several people in this room can speak to my competence, but I'd prefer to let the documentation speak for itself. She turned to the room. The calculations I prepared are based on 3 sources, all publicly verifiable: the Northern Pacific's own publicly filed route documentation, county land assessment records, and comparable sales data from 2 other territories where similar acquisitions preceded railroad announcements. She paused. I invite anyone in this room, including Mr. Whitmore, to identify a specific error in the analysis. If there's a mistake in the numbers, I want to know. If there isn't, she let the pause hold for 1 beat. Then the numbers are the numbers. Silence. Whitmore looked at her with an expression that was still composed, and was also underneath the composure something considerably less warm. Miss Doyle, he said, the question of your analysis aside, you came to this territory without local connections, took a position in a bachelor's household, and are now positioning yourself as an authority on land transactions that affect this entire community. I think the people in this room are entitled to wonder about the nature of your interest here. It was elegantly done, not explicit enough to be directly challenged, exactly suggestive enough to plant what he needed to plant. The room felt it. The slight shift in the air that happens when a social transaction has taken place that everyone present understands and nobody is quite willing to name. Margaret felt it land. She kept her face exactly as it was. She opened her mouth to respond, and Ethan Walker stood up from his chair. He stood up in the particular way he had stood up for her at the grain supplier's office, without drama, without announcement, with the simple, decisive physicality of a man who has made a decision and is implementing it. That's enough, he said. Not loud. He didn't need loud. Miss Doyle is here in her professional capacity, which she has earned through 8 weeks of work on my ranch that has saved me more money than I'd care to admit in public, and protected every rancher in this room from a land deal that would have cost them significantly. He looked at Whitmore with the flat, clear gaze of a man who has finished managing himself and is now simply telling the truth. If you have a problem with her analysis, address the analysis. If what you actually have a problem with is a woman who is better at this than the people you brought with you, that's your problem, Mr. Whitmore, not ours. The room was very quiet. Whitmore looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Whitmore. Something passed between them that had nothing to do with land or railroads or documents. Something older and simpler, the particular transaction that happens between a man who is used to winning and a man who has decided he isn't going to let him. Then Garrison, who had been sitting with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man trying to hold a decision, said, "How do I withdraw the letter of intent I already signed?" And the room shifted entirely. Margaret reached into her satchel. She had the template withdrawal letter. She had prepared it 4 days ago because she had known this moment was possible if everything else held, and she had not allowed herself to count on it, but she had prepared for it. She set it on the table in front of Garrison. "Fill in your name and the date," she said, "and the address at the top. It needs to be delivered to Whitmore's office by Friday." Garrison picked up the pen that the county clerk offered, and he began to write. Whitmore stood up. His composure was still in place, but it had the quality now of something that is being maintained through effort rather than naturally. "This meeting is not a venue for," he began. "This is a community meeting," Commissioner Ellsworth said in the slow, deliberate voice of a man who does not hurry and cannot be hurried. "In our community's building, on our community's schedule." He looked at Whitmore with the amiable inflexibility of a boulder. "Miss Doyle has the floor." Whitmore sat down. Margaret looked at the room. Every face was turned toward her. These were not easy faces. They were weathered, cautious, independently minded people who had built something in a difficult place and were deeply suspicious of anything that arrived from outside, telling them what it was worth. They were exactly the faces she had been working toward from the beginning, and they were looking at her not with the dismissiveness of the fair or the social skepticism of the hotel breakfast, but with the focused attention of people who are deciding whether to trust something. She said, "I want to be clear about one thing. This is your land. Every person in this room built what they have through work I can't fully account for in a spreadsheet. Nobody in this room should sell because they were pressured, and nobody in this room should hold because I told them the numbers favor it." She paused. "But you deserve to make that decision knowing what you actually have. That's all I'm here for." The room was quiet. Then Henderson said, "What do we do if he sends the formal contract this week?" "Don't sign before reading it to the end," Margaret said. "If you have any question about specific language, bring it to me. I'll read it with you. For free," one of the ranchers at the back said, not rudely, just practically. "For free," she said. Ethan from his seat watched her. He watched the room look at her and hear her and begin visibly to change the category they had placed her in. Not the plain awkward woman from the freight wagon at the livestock fair. Not the suspicious out-of-territory arrival in the bachelor's household. But something else. Something that had been there from the beginning, and that the room was only now learning to see. He felt something in his chest that was not a new feeling, but had become considerably harder to ignore. He had called her brave in his mind before. He had thought it without quite looking at it directly, the way you think about something that is close to the center of something you are not ready to examine. He looked at it now. She was the bravest person he had ever watched stand in a room. Not because she was unafraid. He knew her well enough by now to know she was not performing fearlessness. There had been a moment when Whitmore said what he said about the nature of her interest, when something had moved across her face that cost her something to control. She was brave because she controlled it and stayed anyway. Because the work mattered more than her comfort. Because she had walked into that room knowing exactly what kind of room it would be, and she had prepared for it, and she had stood in it, and she had told the truth. Whitmore left before the meeting formally closed. He did not make a scene. He gathered his associates and his leather folder, and he left with the contained efficiency of a man who is recalibrating, rather than retreating, who has lost this particular ground and is already thinking about the next approach. Margaret watched him go. She knew it was not over. Men like Whitmore did not lose one room and accept it. They came back through different doors with different tools, and the fact that he had been publicly embarrassed in a community meeting meant that whatever came next would be less elegant and less patient. She knew this. She thought about it as the room began to break up around her, as ranchers came to look at the documents she had prepared, as the county clerk took a copy of the withdrawal template to keep on file, as Garrison finished filling in his withdrawal letter and folded it with the precise care of a man who has nearly made a terrible mistake and is acutely aware of it. Henderson put his hand on her shoulder briefly in passing the way. Men in that territory express things they did not have words for. She nodded. Ethan was beside her when the last of the ranchers had filed out, and they stood in the quiet of the emptied room together, and he did not say anything immediately, which she had come to understand was the way he processed things that mattered. After a moment he said simply, "You did it." "We did it," she said. "Your name is the reason that room listened." "My name opened the room," he said. "You kept it open." She looked at him. The lamplight in the room had the quality of late afternoon, long and golden, and slightly melancholy, the kind of light that makes everything look more serious than it might otherwise. She looked at him in that light, and thought with a clarity that was almost physical that she was in serious trouble. Not the Whitmore kind. The other kind. The kind she had decided quite firmly not to be in. She picked up her satchel. "We should get back before dark," she said. "Yes," he said. They walked out of the church together. Outside, Coles was leaning against a post across the street watching them go. Neither of them acknowledged him. But Margaret registered it. And she thought whatever Whitmore does next, he does it now. She was right about that too. Coles was still leaning against that post when Margaret looked back one final time before the wagon turned the corner out of Caldwell Creek. He was not pretending to do anything else. He was simply watching them go, with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who has been told to observe and report, and who is very good at exactly that. He caught her looking, and he did not look away, which was itself a message, the kind that says, "We see you, and we want you to know we see you." She turned back to the road. Ethan had seen it too. She knew because his hands tightened on the reins in the particular way that meant he was managing something internally. "He'll file a formal complaint," Margaret said, "with the county land office. It won't have merit, but it doesn't need to. It just needs to create a delay and a question mark over the withdrawal Garrison filed. Can he do that? Ethan said. He can file anything he wants. The question is whether it holds. She paused. I need to speak with a lawyer. Tomorrow morning if possible. Is there one in Caldwell Creek you trust? James Whitfield, Ethan said. He's handled my family's land matters since my father's time. Can you arrange a meeting for first thing tomorrow? I'll ride into town tonight and leave a message at his office. She looked at him. You don't need to do that tonight, she said. I know I don't need to, he said. It was the same voice he had used when he said, I want to be there outside the grain supplier's office. The voice that was not asking for permission and was not performing generosity. Just stating a fact. She turned back to the road. Thank you, she said. The message was left that evening. James Whitfield was at the Walker Ranch by 8 the next morning, sitting across the kitchen table from Margaret with a copy of Garrison's withdrawal letter and the original letter of intent. And he had the alert, quick-moving quality of a man who had been practicing law in frontier territory long enough to recognize when something was actually important. He read both documents twice. The withdrawal is valid, he said. The 5-day window is clear in the original letter, and Garrison filed within it. Whitmore can challenge, but he won't prevail. He looked up at Margaret. Where did you get this template? I drafted it from standard land agreement language, she said, based on the withdrawal provision in the original. Whitfield looked at her with the slightly arrested expression of a man recalibrating. You drafted this yourself, he said. Is there a problem with it? She said. Not remotely, he said. It's cleaner than what I would have produced. He set the papers down. What else are you concerned about? She told him about the community meeting, about Whitmore's performance and the public humiliation and Cole's watching them leave, about the pattern she had seen the dinner the individual offer to her, the attempt to discredit her at the meeting. Whitfield listened without interrupting, which was a professional skill, and also, she thought, a genuine quality. He'll go after the documents, Whitfield said when she finished. Not Garrison's withdrawal specifically that's settled. He'll try to cast doubt on the methodology of your analysis before the ranchers who haven't made a decision yet can act on it. He needs 3 or 4 of them. He doesn't need everyone. How? Margaret said. He has money, and he has time, and he has contacts in the territorial office who owe him things, Whitfield said. He could file an objection with the land assessor claiming the value projections in your document are misleading. It wouldn't succeed, but the process takes 6 weeks, and during those 6 weeks, the uncertainty is enough to make the undecided ranchers nervous. And nervous ranchers sign with whoever makes them feel safest, Margaret said. Exactly. She was quiet for a moment. How do we prevent that? She said. Whitfield leaned back. You file first, he said. You submit the analysis to the territorial land assessor's office before Whitmore can file an objection. A proactive submission with full documentation and source citations. Once it's in the official record, as submitted, not challenge, the barrier for him to raise a credible objection goes up considerably. He paused. I can do the filing, but I need everything. Every source, every calculation, every reference document. I can have it prepared by tomorrow afternoon, Margaret said. Ethan, who had been sitting at the end of the table, listening with the quiet attention he brought to things that mattered, said, What's the cost? Whitfield looked at him. For the filing, minimal. For my time, we'll settle that after this is resolved. He paused. Ethan, this woman just saved 6 ranching families a significant amount of money in a public meeting. I'll bill you at cost. Ethan nodded. Whitfield looked back at Margaret. I have one other question, he said. And I ask it as counsel, not as a curious man, so it stays in this room. Go ahead, she said. Is there anything in your background that Whitmore could use? Any professional dispute, any matter of record, any circumstance that removed from context could be made to look like something other than what it was. The question landed with the clean directness of something that needed to be asked. Margaret held his gaze. My last employer died insolvent, she said. The business failed after his death. I was owed 3 months of salary that I never received. If Whitmore found that and framed it as a woman who had been dismissed for financial misconduct, it could be made to sound like something it wasn't. Whitfield nodded slowly. The insolvency was documented. Public record. Helena Territorial Records. Silas Pratt Dry Goods dissolved June of this year. And your employment was? I have 2 letters of reference from suppliers who worked with us. Both can be contacted. She paused. I also have 8 years of clean accounts and not one client dispute on record. But I know that doesn't prevent a rumor. No, Whitfield said. It doesn't. He looked at Ethan. If Whitmore goes after her personally, rather than professionally, the documentation protects her legally, but not socially. I know, Ethan said. His voice had the quality it had developed over the past weeks, the quality of a man who has stopped pretending that something is abstract when it is personal. Whitfield gathered his papers. I'll need everything by tomorrow afternoon, he said to Margaret. You'll have it, she said. She worked through that night, not with the frantic energy of desperation, but with the focused, methodical intensity of a woman who has always worked best when the stakes are highest, who does her clearest thinking under pressure, because pressure removes everything unnecessary and leaves only the work. Ethan came to the study at 11 with coffee and bread and did not speak unnecessarily, and around midnight he fell asleep in the chair by the desk with his long legs stretched out and his head tipped back and his breathing slow and even, and Margaret looked at him for a moment, just a moment, and then returned to her papers. She finished at 3 in the morning. She organized everything into a document package that Whitfield could file without modification, set it on the corner of the desk, and permitted herself 30 seconds of sitting with her eyes closed in the lamplight before she extinguished it and went to bed. In the morning, she found that someone had put a blanket over Ethan at some point in the night, folded across his legs with the careful, unsentimental precision that could only have been Agnes. She did not mention it to either of them. She gave the package to Whitfield at 9 that morning. He read through it at his office while she waited, making occasional notes, asking 2 questions of clarification. And at the end of it, he looked at her over the top of the pages with an expression that contained genuine professional respect. I've been practicing law for 19 years, he said. And, she said, this is the clearest financial brief I have received from a non-attorney, he said, bar none. Will it hold? She said. It will hold, he said. He filed it that afternoon, and then the waiting began. Waiting, Margaret had learned, was its own kind of work. It required the discipline of not acting when action would feel better, but would not help the discipline of continuing the ordinary business of each day, while something important moved through channels you could not see or accelerate. She returned to the ranch accounts. There were still things to optimize, still contracts to refine, still the fall cattle pricing strategy to develop. The work did not stop because the larger battle was in a waiting phase, and she was grateful for that. Grateful that there was always something concrete to do. Something with columns that balanced or did not balance something that responded to attention and effort with measurable results. The nights were harder. The 60-day trial arrangement had 19 days left. She had not thought about this with any particular focus. For several weeks, she had been too absorbed in the work to think about anything beyond the work. But in the evenings now, when the documentation was filed, and the immediate crisis had shifted into a phase that required waiting rather than action, she found herself aware of the number in a way she had not been before. 19 days. She had nowhere to go. This was not a secret from herself. She had no family, no waiting position, no plan beyond the 60 days, because she had not allowed herself to build one, because building a plan that assumed a future here would have required acknowledging something she had decided not to acknowledge. She sat with this on a Thursday evening in the study, after Ethan had said goodnight and the house had gone quiet, and she looked at the number with the same honesty she brought to any set of numbers that did not resolve the way she wanted them to. 19 days. Then what? She did not answer the question. She closed the ledger and went to bed. The answer arrived before she was ready for it, the way answers sometimes do, through a door you were not watching. It was Agnes. On Friday morning, Agnes came to the study with coffee and did not leave. She set the coffee down and stood on the other side of the desk, and folded her hands in front of her with the expression of a woman who has decided to say something and is going to say it regardless of whether it is comfortable. "How long is your arrangement with Mr. Walker?" Agnes said. Margaret looked up. "The trial period is 19 days, she said. Agnes nodded as if this confirmed something she already suspected. "And after," Agnes said, "that depends on Mr. Walker's assessment." Margaret said carefully. "Does it depend on yours?" Agnes said. "A beat." "Agnes, I've worked for Ethan Walker for 11 years, Agnes said. "I watched him after that woman left. I watched him close himself up like a house where someone has died, board up the windows, stop answering the door." Her voice was level and direct and not unkind. "I have watched that man every day for 11 years, and I have not seen him be what he has been these past weeks." Margaret was very still. "What has he been?" she said quietly. "Present," Agnes said. "He has been present." She looked at Margaret with the plain, undecorated honesty of someone who has decided that circumstances require it. "You did that." "The work?" "It's not the work," Agnes said. "The work is part of it, but it's not the whole of it, and you know that." Margaret looked at her. "What is it you're trying to tell me?" she said. "I'm trying to tell you," Agnes said, with the measured patience of someone who has decided to say a thing exactly once, "that if you leave in 19 days because you've decided you don't deserve to stay, you will be making the same mistake he made for 5 years. And I will not watch two people do the same foolish thing out of pride or stubbornness or whatever else they want to call it." She picked up the empty coffee cup, replaced it with the full one, and left. Margaret sat very still for a long time. She was not thinking about the ledger. She was thinking about what Agnes had said specifically, the phrase, "You don't deserve to stay," which was not an accusation, but a diagnosis delivered with the accuracy of someone who has been watching the patient long enough to understand the illness. She had not framed it to herself that way. She had framed it as professionalism, as appropriate boundaries, as the discipline of keeping a personal and professional arrangement in its correct categories. She had told herself quite convincingly that her restraint was rational. Agnes had looked at it from the outside and called it what it was. She did not know what to do with that. She picked up her pen and returned to the ledger, and did not think about it with considerable effort for the rest of the morning. The formal complaint from Whitmore's office arrived that afternoon, not to the land assessor as Whitfield had anticipated. It was more direct than that. A letter addressed to Ethan Walker from Whitmore's attorney, disputing the accuracy of the analysis distributed at the community meeting, and stating an intention to seek damages for reputational harm caused by the claims made therein. Margaret read it at the kitchen table, where Agnes had set it when it arrived. Her first reaction was not alarm. It was recognition. She had seen this move before in Helena, when Silas Pratt had produced documentation that embarrassed a business partner. The threat of legal action is not always about winning a legal action. Sometimes it is about creating fear of cost and complexity, making the target feel that continuing is more expensive than stopping. It was a pressure tactic. She wrote 3 lines on a separate piece of paper and set it under the letter. "This is a pressure tactic. He is not going to file. The cost of discovery would expose the acquisition strategy we've already documented. Send this to Whitfield with a note asking him to confirm and respond accordingly." Ethan read both papers when he came in from the south pasture. He read the letter once. Read her note twice. He stood there for a moment. Then he walked to his desk, wrote a note to Whitfield, and dispatched Peterson to deliver it before supper. He came back to the kitchen where Margaret was sitting with a second cup of coffee and the accounts for the fall cattle pricing, and he sat down across from her and said, "Are you afraid of him?" She looked up. "Of Whitmore. Of what he can do," Ethan said. "Not legally. The other things. The way he came after you at the meeting. The rumors. The offer to buy you away." He looked at her directly. "He's going to keep coming. Maybe not here specifically, but wherever you go after, if word spreads that you were involved in blocking his acquisition, he has the reach to make that difficult." She held his gaze. "I know that," she said. "Does it change anything for you?" he said. She thought about the honest answer. It makes the cost clearer, she said. It doesn't change the calculation. She set down her pen. What I helped you do was right. The ranchers who kept their land were always going to keep it in any just version of this situation. The fact that Whitmore is powerful enough to make the aftermath uncomfortable for me doesn't change whether the thing itself was right. Ethan looked at her for a long time. You don't do anything halfway, he said. It was not quite a question. I've never seen the value in it, she said. He was quiet. Then the 60-day arrangement. She went very still. Ends in 19 days, she said carefully. I know when it ends, he said. I'm asking what you're planning to do when it does. She looked at him. This was the question she had been not answering for 3 weeks, and it was now sitting on the kitchen table between them with the kind of weight that requires a response. I haven't finalized a plan, she said. It was the most honest thing she could say that was still within the bounds of what she had allowed herself to acknowledge. Then I'd like to propose a different arrangement, Ethan said. He said it in the same direct, measured voice in which he said everything, not elaborate, not performed, not decorated with more words than the thing required. She waited. Permanent position, he said. Full wages reviewed annually. The same terms for lodging unless... He stopped. Started again. The same terms at minimum, whatever you're comfortable with. She looked at him. He looked back. They were two people who were very good at saying exactly what they meant, and were currently both saying something slightly different from what they actually meant, and they both knew it, and neither of them was quite ready to close the distance between what they were saying and what they meant. I'd want to continue managing the accounts, she said. Obviously, he said. And the supplier relationships. Yes. And if there are future situations like the Whitmore matter, I would want you involved in everyone, he said. A pause. All right, she said. It was not the conversation it would eventually become. It was the conversation they could have right now in this kitchen with the accounts spread between them and the late afternoon light coming through the window, and both of them keeping a careful distance from the center of what was actually happening. But something had shifted. The 19 days had become something else. Not an ending, but a hinge. A point at which one arrangement became another, and the new arrangement was indefinite, and indefinite was the word she had been afraid to think about. Margaret, he said. She looked up. Thank you, he said. Not for the accounts, not for the documents, for... He stopped. He was not a man who found the right words easily when the thing was personal. For being honest with me. From the beginning. The way you've been honest. She looked at him. You could have handled all of this, she said quietly. You're not a man who needs saving. No, he said. But I was a man who needed to be seen. He held her gaze. There's a difference. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, one of the ranch hands called something to another, and there was brief laughter, and then it faded, and they sat in the quiet with the particular quality of it that had become over 8 weeks the most honest silence she had ever been in. She picked up her pen. I'll need to review the fall cattle pricing before the week's out, she said. I know, he said. He stood. He paused at the door. One more thing, he said. He said it with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been building toward a sentence for a long time and is finally producing it. Whitmore put a letter on your character in front of half the county, what he implied. He looked at her. I want you to know that anyone in this county who repeats it will hear from me directly, and they won't repeat it twice. She felt something move in her chest. She managed to keep her voice entirely steady. I appreciate that, she said. He nodded once and left. She looked at the pen in her hand. She set it down. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table and her eyes not focused on anything in particular, and something warm and terrifying and entirely unwelcome moving through her chest, and she sat with it the way you sit with something you have finally stopped fighting, not surrendering to it exactly, just acknowledging that the fighting had been exhausting both of you. Agnes passing the kitchen doorway with a basket of laundry did not slow down. But Margaret heard her make a sound, small, wordless, the specific sound of a woman who has arranged for exactly this outcome, and is not entirely surprised by how it has unfolded. Whitfield sent word 2 days later that Whitmore's attorney had responded to his letter by confirming that the complaint would not be filed. No explanation offered. None was required. Margaret received the news with quiet satisfaction and no surprise. Ethan received it with slightly more visible relief than he probably intended to show, and she did not mention what she had seen on his face, because she had learned over 8 weeks which things he needed her to see and which things he needed to have not witnessed. The community continued its own adjustments. Perry came to the ranch the following week with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has something to say that is not entirely comfortable to say. "Miss Doyle," he said at the door, "I owe you an apology." Margaret looked at him. "What for?" she said. "For what I said to Aldrich after the breakfast meeting," Perry said. About the nature of your position here, and what I thought about it." He held her gaze with the steady discomfort of a man doing something genuinely hard. "I was wrong, and I was unkind, and the work you did at that county meeting—" He stopped. "You saved my land, and I repaid you by talking about you the way I did. That's not the kind of man I want to be." A long pause. Margaret looked at him. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. And she meant it not as a social grace but genuinely. There was a significant difference between a man who realized he had been wrong and a man who came to say so, and Perry had made the longer journey. "Is there anything I can do," he said, "to make it right?" She thought. "Tell the truth when you hear it repeated," she said. "That's all." Perry nodded. He shook her hand firmly, as an equal, and left. Agnes appeared from the direction of the kitchen. "He's a stubborn man," Agnes said. "Coming here cost him something." "I know," Margaret said. "That's why it mattered." Agnes looked at her with the expression that had been building for several weeks and had finally arrived at something uncomplicated. "You're good for this place," Agnes said. "I should have said so sooner." Margaret looked at the woman who had been running this house for 11 years, who had brought extra butter and blankets and coffee at midnight, and who had said exactly the right thing at the right moment without being asked. "So are you," she said. Agnes made a sound that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite dismissal, and went back to the kitchen. Ethan found Margaret that evening at the fence of the south pasture. She had gone there. She had not examined why she had gone there, but she had gone there, and she was standing with her arms folded on the top rail, looking at the land that was going to be developed now this coming year, that had been waiting for 4 years for resources that had been draining away through a crack she had found and sealed. She heard him come up beside her. "The water system for the east barn," she said without turning. "Do you want me to get quotes from contractors? I can build a comparison into the fall budget." He stood beside her. "Margaret," he said. His voice was different. Not the careful, measured voice of the kitchen table. Not the flat voice of a man managing himself. Something less managed. Something that had given up managing in the last few seconds and was just speaking. She turned to look at him. His expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, not the absence of something, but the presence of it. The presence of something he had been keeping behind the controlled stillness, and that had finally come to the surface with the particular force of things that have been contained too long. "I am not good at this," he said. "I want you to know that before I say the rest of it. I am not a man who does this well." She looked at him. "Does what?" she said quietly. "This," he said. "What I'm about to say." He held her gaze. 60 days ago, I shook your hand in a fairground and I told myself it was a business decision. And it was. But it was also the first time in 5 years that another person made me feel less like someone who was managing his own isolation and more like someone who was actually living his own life. She did not speak. "You came here and you did the work," he said. "And you were honest when honesty was difficult. And you were brave in rooms where bravery cost you something. And you never asked me to be something I wasn't. You just—" He stopped. Started again. "You just dealt with me as I actually am. Not as what I was supposed to be, or what someone hoped I'd become, or what someone wanted to rescue me into being. He looked at her. You just saw me. And kept working. The evening was still around them. Ethan, she said. Her voice was very steady, and what it cost her to keep it steady was something she would not allow to show, because she had decided something 8 weeks ago about what this was and what it wasn't. And that decision was currently requiring more effort to maintain than any other effort she had made in this entire experience. I know what the arrangement was, he said, and I know you'll tell me you're a professional, and the arrangement was professional. And this is not the correct I know all the things you could say. He met her eyes. I'm not asking you to say anything you don't mean. I'm only telling you what's true from where I'm standing. She looked at him in the evening light, with the south pasture behind him and the ranch house behind her, and 8 weeks of the most genuine, useful, honest work she had ever done, wrapped around all of it, like something she had not known she was building. She thought about Agnes. She thought about, you don't deserve to stay. She thought about 19 days that had become not an ending. She thought about the thing she had been pressing down with both hands for 3 weeks. She let go of it. I'm staying, she said. It was not an answer to his specific words. It was more than that. It was a statement of a decision that had been made quietly in the lamplight of the study at 3 a.m. that she had not been willing to look at directly until right now. He looked at her. Yes, he said. Not I know, or good, or anything decorated. Just yes. The way he said everything that mattered. They stood at the fence of the south pasture in the evening quiet, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and they did not need to. And that not needing was, she thought, more than most people ever found. The words spread through Caldwell Creek, the way words always spread in small territories, not all at once but in pieces, each piece slightly larger than the last, until the full shape of the thing became visible to everyone at approximately the same moment. Margaret Doyle was staying, not on a trial arrangement, not for 60 days. Permanently as financial manager of the Walker Ranch in a capacity that Ethan Walker had made no effort to obscure or minimize. He had told Peterson first because Peterson needed to know for operational reasons, and Peterson had told the other ranch hands, and one of the ranch hands had a brother in town, and by the following Thursday, Mildred Paxton had the information, and once Mildred Paxton had something, it was effectively public record. The reactions were what you would expect, and then gradually something different. Clara Hennessy, who had made the pie and watched Margaret walk across the fairground toward Ethan with the expression of a woman watching something she could not categorize, said nothing for 3 days. Then she appeared at the ranch on a Saturday morning with a jar of preserves, left it with Agnes, and drove away without requesting acknowledgement. Agnes put the preserves in the pantry and told Margaret about it with the neutral tone of someone reporting weather. She didn't ask to see me, Margaret said. No, Agnes said. Then she's not apologizing, Margaret said. She's deciding. Yes, Agnes said. Same as the rest of them. The rest of them were deciding at varying speeds. Perry had already completed his reckoning and moved on. Garrison came by to thank Margaret directly for the withdrawal letter, stayed for coffee, and left looking lighter than he had looked since before Whitmore's first letter arrived. Henderson's wife sent a note, handwritten, brief, not elaborate, that said simply, "Thank you for what you did for our family. We won't forget it." Margaret read it twice and set it in the drawer, where she kept things that mattered. Dorothy Aldrich took the longest. She came on a Tuesday 3 weeks after the county meeting, dressed more carefully than the occasion required, which Margaret understood immediately as the armor of a woman who is doing something that makes her uncomfortable and is using formality as a shield. Agnes showed her to the sitting room and came to find Margaret in the study with the expression of someone who has seen something interesting and is curious how it will resolve. Margaret set down her pen. She went to the sitting room. Dorothy Aldrich was sitting very straight in the chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her face arranged in the controlled pleasantness of a woman managing a social situation she had not fully planned for. Margaret knew, one of the women who had been sharpest at the livestock fair. one of the ones with the fan and the particular smile that required no words. "Miss Doyle," Dorothy said. "Mrs. Aldrich," Margaret said, and sat down across from her. A pause. "I came to say something," Dorothy said. "And I'm going to say it plainly, because I think you're a woman who prefers plain." "I am," Margaret said. "I was unkind to you," Dorothy said, "at the fair and afterward, and I was unkind in the specific way that women are sometimes unkind to each other. That doesn't leave any evidence because it's all in expressions and silence, and what you choose not to say." She met Margaret's eyes directly, which cost her something visible. "And then you saved my husband's land, and my family's future. And you did it without asking anything from us, and without requiring us to have been better than we were." She stopped. "I don't know what to do with that except to come here and say I was wrong." The room was quiet. Margaret looked at her. She thought about what it cost a woman like Dorothy Aldrich, careful, socially precise, deeply invested in the order of things, to sit in this chair and say those words. It was not a small thing. It was, in its way, an act of courage proportionate to the person performing it. "I appreciate you coming," Margaret said. And then, because she meant it, and because plain was what she preferred, it matters that you said it in person. Dorothy exhaled a small controlled release of something she had been holding. "I'd like to start again," Dorothy said, "if that's possible." "It's possible," Margaret said. Dorothy stayed for 20 minutes. The conversation was careful, and a little formal, and genuinely warm. Underneath the formality, the warmth of two people who are finding their way toward something they have not been before. When she left, she shook Margaret's hand at the door, and it was a real handshake, not social, not performative, the kind that means something. Agnes appeared the moment the door closed. "Well," Agnes said. "Well," Margaret said. "She came," Agnes said. "She came," Margaret confirmed. Agnes made the sound she made when things resolved the way they should and went back to the kitchen. The ranch had changed in ways that were visible to everyone who worked on it, and some that were only visible to the people who lived inside it. Peterson ran the hands with a confidence that had been missing under Briggs, a quiet, steady authority that did not require volume or performance, and under which the daily work had a different quality. Things were handled before they became problems. Decisions were made at the level where they belonged instead of escalating. The whole operation breathed more easily. The South Pasture development had begun. A contractor from Billings had been sourced, quoted, and hired at a figure that Margaret had negotiated to 11% below the first offer, which the contractor had accepted with the resigned respect of someone who recognized he was not going to do better. The East Barn water system was scheduled for early spring. The financial position of the ranch, which 8 weeks ago had been quietly hemorrhaging through supplier fraud and operational inefficiency, was now what it should have been all along. Solid, with reserves, with a clear forward plan, and no hidden leaks. Ethan knew all of this. He knew it because Margaret reported it to him with the same direct clarity she had brought to everything from the first afternoon at the lemonade table at the fairground. But knowing it in reports was different from what he experienced in the daily reality of it. The particular sensation of a man who has been carrying something heavy for so long, he forgot what not carrying felt like, and has now set it down and cannot stop being surprised by the lightness. He caught himself on a Wednesday morning standing in the barn and doing nothing for several minutes, because there was nothing urgent requiring his attention, and the absence of urgency was still even now mildly disorienting. Peterson found him there. "Something wrong," Peterson said. "No," Ethan said. Peterson looked at him with the quiet perceptiveness of a man who had been watching his employer closely for 3 years and had noticed the change over the past weeks. "Ranch runs better than it ever has," Peterson said, not elaborately, just stating it. "I know," Ethan said. "Miss Doyle." Peterson started. "I know," Ethan said again. Peterson nodded once and went about his work, and Ethan stood in the barn for another minute and thought about the word staying and what it meant when you said it to someone and they said it back to you, and how that exchange was both the simplest possible thing and somehow the largest thing he had managed in 5 years. He went to find her. She was in the study where else with the fall cattle pricing spread across the desk and her pen moving steadily. She looked up when she heard his step in the way she had looked up every time he appeared in that doorway over the past weeks. Not with startlement, because she always heard him coming, but with the particular attention of someone for whom another person's arrival is not an interruption. "The contractor wants to start the south pasture work second week of October," he said. "That works with the cattle schedule," she said. "The fall drive will be finished by then." He nodded. He stood in the doorway. "I want to show you something," he said. She set down her pen. He brought her to the cottonwood tree at the edge of the property, the old one with the trunk wide enough that two people standing on opposite sides of it could not see each other, the one that had been there longer than the ranch and longer than his family's time on the land. He had come here to think for as long as he could remember, and he had not brought another person here since before Rebecca, and he had brought Margaret here now with the specific intention of that meaning something. She stood beside him and looked out at the pasture. "My father planted the fence line from here," Ethan said. "He said if you find the right tree to measure from everything else falls into line." She looked at the fence line. "He was right," she said. "He was right about most things," Ethan said. "He was also a man who showed up for the people who depended on him." A pause. "I've been trying to do that. The past few years I thought I was doing it. Keeping the ranch running, keeping the hands employed, keeping everything in order." He looked at the fence line. "I wasn't showing up for anyone. I was just maintaining. There's a difference." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "There is." He turned to face her directly. "You told me something at the livestock fair," he said, "in front of half the town. You said everyone keeps asking what kind of wife I want, and nobody asks whether I'm tired of pretending I don't need anyone." She remembered it exactly. She had said it, knowing it would land, knowing it might cost her any professional opportunity in that town, knowing it was the kind of truth that either reaches someone or closes a door permanently. "I remember," she said. "I've been thinking about it for 8 weeks," he said, "about why it hit me the way it did." He paused. "It's because it was the first time someone addressed the actual question instead of working around it. Everyone else was trying to reach me by being what they thought I wanted. You weren't trying to reach me at all. You were just telling the truth." She held his gaze. "I didn't say it to reach you," she said. "I said it because it was true, and I'd been watching you for 20 minutes, and it seemed important that someone said it." "I know," he said. "That's exactly why it worked." He looked at her with the unguarded expression she had first seen at the south pasture fence, the one that had cost him something to allow, and that he was allowing again now, with more steadiness than before. "I don't want a woman who wants the ranch, Margaret. I never did. I want the person who looked at the rancher and told him the truth about himself. The one who stayed when things got difficult, and who worked beside me, and who was brave in rooms where bravery cost her something, and who—" He stopped. The words were failing him in the way words failed men like him when the thing was too large for his usual economy. "I'm not eloquent," he said. "I know you're not," she said. It was not an unkindness. It was the thing she loved most about him, that he said exactly what he had and trusted it to be enough. "Will it do?" he said. She looked at him. She thought about Ohio and Helena and a freight wagon and a livestock fair and a lemonade table and 7 years of ranch ledgers spread across a desk and a county meeting and a south pasture fence and a kitchen at midnight and Agnes with the extra butter and the blanket and the 6 words that had cut through everything she had been telling herself. "You don't deserve to stay." She had deserved to stay all along. "Yes," she said. "It will do." He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with elaborate gesture. The way a man takes the hand of someone he has decided to stop being afraid of losing quietly, with the full weight of the decision in it, and no performance around it. She let him. They stood at the cottonwood tree where his father had measured the fence line with the pasture opening ahead of them and the ranch at their backs, and the enormous unhurried sky of Montana territory over everything, and it was not a rescue, and it was not a reward. and it was not the ending of anything. It was the beginning of two people who had both been alone for a very long time, choosing with full knowledge of what that choice cost, and what it gave back not to be alone anymore. The wedding was in November. Small, which was what they both wanted, because neither of them was a person who required an audience for the things that mattered most. Agnes cried and refused to acknowledge that she was crying. Peterson and 3 of the senior ranch hands attended. James Whitfield brought his wife. Garrison came with his wife and his daughter. Henderson brought his whole family. Dorothy Aldrich brought flowers. She brought them to the door that morning, handed them to Margaret without elaborate ceremony, and said, "These are from my garden. I thought you might want them." Margaret looked at the flowers. She thought about the livestock fair and the fan and the smile that required no words. "Thank you, Dorothy," she said. Dorothy nodded briskly and went to find her seat, and Margaret stood for a moment with Montana wildflowers in her hands, and felt with a clarity that was almost physical the distance between who she had been that morning at the fair, dusty, sweating alone, walking toward a man who didn't know she existed in a town that had already decided what she was and who she was now. She had not changed. That was the thing. She had not become prettier or younger or more elegant. She had not transformed herself into something the town could more easily categorize. She had simply continued being exactly what she had always been. Competent, direct, honest, brave when it mattered. And the world around her had slowly, imperfectly, in its own time, learned to see what had always been there. Ethan was waiting. He was standing at the front of the small church with the particular stillness of a man who has made a decision and is completely at peace with it. And when Margaret walked down the aisle, no ceremony, just walking the way she walked toward everything, he watched her come with an expression that contained nothing held back. No performance, no management, just a man looking at the person who had told him the truth when he needed it most and had stayed when it would have been easier to go. She stopped beside him. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You're not nervous," she said quietly so only he could hear. "No," he said. "Why not?" she said. "Because I know exactly what I'm doing," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she smiled, not the careful, controlled expression she used in professional settings, not the polite acknowledgement she offered social situations, but the real one, the one that very few people had seen, the one that changed her face into something that all the women at the livestock fair with their fans and their careful assessments had missed entirely because they had stopped looking before they could see it. Ethan saw it. He had been seeing it for months. The ceremony was brief and true, and contained no words that either of them would later struggle to mean. Afterward, outside in the November air, Peterson shook Ethan's hand, and then, with the slight awkwardness of a man doing something slightly outside his usual range, turned to Margaret and said, "This ranch is lucky to have you, ma'am. We all know it." She looked at him. "Thank you, Peterson," she said. "So am I." Agnes nearby made the sound she made when things were exactly as they should be. Charles Whitmore left the territory in December, his acquisition strategy deprived of the critical Walker parcel and blocked by the coordinated resistance of the neighboring ranches had collapsed below the threshold of viability. The railroad route was confirmed publicly in January, and the land values rose exactly as Margaret's projections had calculated, and the ranchers who had held their land found themselves by spring in a financial position considerably better than any of them had been in for years. There was no formal accounting of what Whitmore had intended to do, no legal consequence beyond the failed acquisition. Men like Whitmore rarely faced that variety of consequence. But he was gone, and the land was still in the hands of the people who had worked it, and that was the result that had always mattered. Margaret added the final entry to the Whitmore file, a clean brief summary of the resolution, and set it in the completed records drawer. She closed the drawer. She sat for a moment at the desk where she had spent so many late nights and early mornings with the familiar smell of the study around her and the familiar sounds of the ranch moving outside. And she thought about everything that had been in this room, the 7 years of ledgers, the payroll revisions, the supplier contracts, the analysis that had saved 6 families, the midnight coffee, and the lamplight, and the chair where Ethan had fallen asleep. She thought about a freight wagon and a satchel and a livestock fair and a conversation at a lemonade table. She thought about what it cost to tell the truth to a stranger in front of half a town and what it gave back. Ethan appeared in the doorway. "Done," he said. She looked at him. "Done," she said. He crossed the room and she stood, and he put his hand against the side of her face with the same quiet, unperforming directness that he brought to everything. And she leaned into it, the way you lean into something you have finally fully allowed yourself to have. "The South Pasture contractor confirmed for next week," he said. "I know," she said. "I approved the schedule yesterday." "The East Barn water system." "March," she said. "I've already drafted the payment terms." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression. The warmth he no longer contained, the presence that had been there since the beginning, and that he no longer had any reason to manage or minimize. "What would I do without you?" he said. She looked up at him, at the man who had stood in a fairground for 5 years, building walls around himself that he thought would keep him safe, and that had only made him lonelier, at the man who had hired her for 60 days and given her a reason to stop running from the idea of staying somewhere, at the man who had stood up in a grain supplier's office and a county meeting and a community of people who had not yet learned to see her and had said plainly without performance, "This woman. This one. You managed for 5 years," she said. "I wasn't living for 5 years," he said. "I was maintaining." She smiled. "There's a difference," she said. "Yes," he said. "There is." Outside the ranch was alive with the ordinary sounds of people doing the work that sustains a life, horses and voices, and the particular percussion of a working place that has found its rhythm. Inside in the study, where 7 years of neglected accounts had been transformed into something honest and forward-looking, Ethan Walker held the hand of the woman who had walked toward him when everyone else was carefully performing at him, and who had told him the truth when the truth was what he needed, and who had stayed when staying was harder than leaving. She had not rescued him. She had simply refused to pretend that what was broken was fine and refused to leave until he understood the difference. And he had not saved her. He had simply, in the end, been brave enough to be worth staying for. The woman nobody looked at twice had become the only woman he would ever look for first in every room. And that plain, honest, undecorated, and absolutely certain was the whole of the story.